The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
All right, everyone, good morning, and thank you for joining our webinar this morning, Beyond Water Point Mapping, Putting Data to Work for Improved Water Services. This webinar today is hosted by Global Water Challenge and the Water Point Data Exchange. We're very excited about the awesome presenters that we have lined up for you today, and we're looking forward to a lively discussion. So my name is Ariel Sayer. I'm going to be giving a few housekeeping notes and introducing our moderator from Akvo, and she will then introduce our presenters. If anyone has any questions or technical issues at any point during the webinar, feel free to email me at ariel.sayer@getf.org. And presentations will be given in about 25 minutes, and then after each presentation, we'll have 15 minutes for question and answers. And as we're going through the presentations, feel free to direct your questions in the question box on your GoToWebinar console, and we'll be able to answer those as we get to the question sections. So thank you, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our moderator. Our moderator today is the amazing Etel Mendez-Castillo of Akvo. Etel is a monitoring and evaluation specialist and advises partners on the use of Akvo tools for good quality monitoring and evaluation. She also co-leads the expansion of Akvo in Latin America and advises software development based on M&E needs. Etel joined Akvo after working in the United States, South Asia, and Latin America, including roles as M&E advisor to the Honduran Ministry of Health's HIV and AIDS program and supporting South Asia's community of evaluators through work with the International Development Research Center. Really excited that she'll be moderating today. Also, another quick note, we have handouts through this webinar. You'll also see that on your screen on the console, and you can download them at any point. So I'm going to now pass it over to Etel. Etel, you have the floor.
Well, thank you, Ariel, and welcome everyone to this webinar. Ariel introduced me, but she didn't say much about Akvo, so just to provide some background. We are an organization that helps people use data by generating technology that helps generate data such as georeference data that you would use for water point mapping, hence our interest in being part of this initiative. And so, as many of you joining the webinar know, too often valuable data sits dormant in PDF reports or Excel spreadsheets, and it never really gets used to its full potential in order to improve water services. On this webinar, our speakers are people who are trying to change that. So we will first hear from Applied Predictive Technologies, which I'll be referring to as APT, about a data dive they did with the data set from the Water Point Data Exchange, WPDx. Then we'll hear from WASHNote on a recently authored white paper entitled Harnessing Water Point Data to Improve Drinking Water Services. And hopefully by the end of the webinar, you will all know of concrete ways to put your data to work in order to improve water services. As I introduce the presenters, be sure to participate in the poll, which should be popping up in your screen in the next few seconds. This is important to us, and then so that we know who is joining us today. But to start us off, and just to make sure that everyone's on the same page, we want to go through a definition of what we mean by water points. So if you look in your screen, and Ariel on the screen, I only have the poll at this moment. Thank you. Okay, so if we look at this definition that we're looking at in the screen comes from Nick Dickinson's white paper, which he will be discussing later today. And so when we speak about water points, we're talking about either a point source from which water is abstracted, such as a borehole, a spring, or a well, or a water supply or distribution points, such as a hand pump installed on a borehole or on a standpipe in the small pipe network. I'm sure Nicholas will touch on this throughout his presentation. So I just wanted to make sure that everyone has an opportunity to go through these definitions, point 1 and 2 in the screen, so that we all understand what we're referring to when we talk about water points. So without further ado, we'll start with Jake Intrater from Applied Predictive Technologies. Jake is an engagement manager at APT, which is a MasterCard company, and a leading analytic software provider focused on in-market testing. He has led consulting engagements with organizations across healthcare, financial services, telecom, and other industries. In the last 6 months, however, Jake has partnered with GETF through a WASH analytics project in APT Charities, which is an organization dedicated to funding data-driven projects with a social mission. Jake graduated from Princeton's Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs, and he is excited to return back to his public policy roots. So, Jake, yeah, the screen is yours.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ethel. And thank you to Ariel and the rest of the Global Water Challenge folks for helping organize this. Brian Banks too. And looking forward to talking with Nick later on his white paper. So thank you for the introduction. I, as we said, work for APT, Applied Predictive Technologies. I'll try not to say all those syllables again. We're a MasterCard company, and we were lucky to be able to work with the Global Water Challenge to help them start to analyze some of their available water point exchange data. So APT is an organization that is focused on enabling better data-driven decisions. In general, we do that through analytic software products, as well as focused consulting teams. We work across the globe for a variety of different clients that you can see at the bottom. So generally, we're private sector focused, but we also have found success and been lucky to do some public sector work as well. And you can go to the next slide. In order to help companies, we've really focused on 4 key competencies around improving data-driven decisions. First, being able to provide advanced data analytics through the platform, through data engineering, et cetera, by building a platform that is fast and efficient through training and institutionalization around best practices for analytics, and also enabling targeting and optimization. I think that you'll see several of these come to light as I actually talk through what our findings were, but just wanted to provide a little bit of an introduction to who APT is and how we typically work in a private sector space. So while we grew out of a private sector space, we found success in the public sector, generally through focusing on 3 different questions. And I think you'll see these 3 questions in our analysis coming up on the water points. But essentially, the 3 questions that we tend to focus on are, 1, did it work? What was the incremental impact of some program that we want to evaluate? In our case, it was water access. We've worked in the past with other organizations like food banks, with schools, et cetera. But that's always a question, just did it work? And then the next 2 questions that follow from there are, what parts of that program work best, and how can we tailor them to become more and more effective? And then following from that, how do we target that program to get to the right citizens, to get to the right customers, and maximize impact to make sure that that program is doing the right things in the right places? So those were the 3 questions that we were thinking about as we started an engagement with the Global Water Challenge. Specifically, we were tackling their WPDx water point exchange data on hundreds of thousands of different water points that follow the definition that you saw before. And we had the goal of being able to provide actionable recommendations for the Global Water Challenge and for their partners that they work with. The couple of data sources that we used, again, WPDx, we also layered in some third-party data sets, specifically including demographics and world pop. And just to give you guys a little bit of context around how we actually tackled this and how we got involved in this space. An APT data dive is kind of a 24-hour analytic hackathon of sorts. So on the left, you guys can see pictures from our office where we were working through this for 24 hours in Washington, D.C. And then we were lucky to be able to join Brian Banks and some other folks from the Global Water Challenge and present in Swaziland to their Department of Water Affairs, to WaterAid, and a couple of other local nonprofits and NGOs that are working on water issues. And we were able to provide the recommendations that came out of our data dive and actually help them understand how they could be implemented. So I think that from there, what I'm going to start to get into is what were the questions that we tackled using WaterPoint data, what were the findings that we had, and what were the specific recommendations and actions that we had suggested and that we started to see being implemented in places like Swaziland. So starting from these first three questions that we tackled in the data dive, essentially, how do we become more efficient in prioritizing risk? How do we become more efficient in helping more people at a lower cost? And how can data just in general be leveraged? We're going to start with the first one. So the first question that we asked was, how should we prioritize investment and understand risk for a broad set of water points? So the way that we tackled this question, and what you guys can see here is a heat map of risk, is that we worked to build a logistic regression model in order to predict risk. And so what you can see in the heat map is in green, water points that were expected to break within 5 years, so this is the risk of a water point breaking within 5 years of its installation. So in green, there is a less than 7% chance that a water point would break within 5 years of its installation. And so on average, those places tend to be less risky inventories of water points. While in red, we see that these are regions that have a larger number of risky water points where, in fact, we would project that 25% of those water points would break within 5 years of installation. The way that we tackled this question was we basically created a population of those water points that we knew had broken within 5 years versus those that we knew had survived their first 5 years after installation. We built a logistic regression with our APT software in order to come up with predictions around the likelihood of a water point breaking. And so what that allows us to do is to then understand across an entire country, where are there areas that are greater and lower risk, and even to know on a water point by water point basis, which ones are higher risk and which ones are lower risk. And that can inform things around investment. So for example, it may be that budget from the green zones can be shifted to the red zones in order to make sure that those red zones have a higher budget for dealing with maintenance and making sure that things don't break quite as frequently. Or it may be that there need to be different strategies around what water points are actually being constructed in those red zones. There's a lot of different things that this type of map can help us do. So in order to build this map, the way that we kind of process the data, and what you're going to see are a couple of different findings, was we looked at all of the data that we had surrounding the attributes of water points. So what was the management type of water points? And what you see here is that community managed water points tended to have the highest % likelihood of breaking within 5 years, while on the right you can see that the private operated water points were much more likely to survive within 5 years. And so that can provide information around what types of water points should be prioritized as people look to build, or it can identify issues and potential solutions for what might be done with community managed water points. The next one looks at the actual construction types and water source subtypes, I think that it's called. So I think that this will probably make sense to many people, but boreholes tend to be a riskier way of building because there are a lot more mechanical vulnerabilities. And that's confirmed within the data. We saw that boreholes tended to be much more likely to break within the first 5 years of construction relative to other things like surface water and different types of water schemes that are able to leverage surface water. The last one that we're going to share, personally, I think is one of the most interesting. What this shares is the relationship between the payment per homestead that was expected from each water point. And what we found was that there was a statistically significant relationship and correlation between the amount that was expected to pay and the likelihood to break. And as the amount that people were expected to pay increases, the likelihood of breaking decreases linearly. So what that seems to indicate is that there needs to be a way to provide payments around these water points in order to keep them from breaking as quickly. There are a lot of complicated things that go into whether or not payments are possible, where that should come from, if it's actually the homesteads or if it can be government funding or some other type of budget. But this type of information at least provides more evidence around the fact that there needs to be a way to have some sort of ongoing system of paying towards these rural water points, where in Swaziland, a large proportion were not, and as a result, were much more likely to break. So we looked at this analysis for Swaziland. We also looked at it for Sierra Leone and for Uganda. So this is just a quick snapshot of some of the other interesting findings that we wanted to call out for folks. So I think things that are interesting to me here were that high employment regions tended to see that places break more frequently, proximity to spare parts suppliers, which I think that makes a lot of sense, and a couple of other things. So I'll pause for one more moment just so that people can see it. I'm happy to come back to this at questions as well. The next thing that I want to quickly talk to is a calculator that we built in order to make this data more usable in the hands of folks. So basically what this calculator allowed us to do was to give people a way to type in all the characteristics they know about an existing water point or a water point that they're thinking about building, and they would be able to see what the expected risk level of that water point is. Do we think that it's going to break within 5 or 7 years? Do we think that it's going to survive for longer than 20 years? So this one is for Sierra Leone. Sierra Leone had substantially more third-party data available around demographics and different aspects of water points, and so it was a little bit more robust. But the goal of this type of exercise is, how do we get information and high-level analytic work into the hands of people who are actually going to be making water point decisions in a way that's easy to use, in a way that can be replicated easily. And so hopefully what this could be used for is kind of evaluating potential water points as people decide whether or not they need to be built, what type of construction they should use, etc. The next question that we focused in on was, how do we help people more efficiently? And efficiently being, how do we help the most amount of people for the least amount of cost? The way that we tackled this question was through repairs and through building new water points. So what this example walks us through is, imagine that there are 2 water points. And what you can see here is that if we actually go back one more step in the animation, it's a little easier to talk to. Great, thank you. So if we have 2 water points represented by the spigots, and they are serving a population, there is some small segment of that population that is served by both of those 2 water points, so they have options and alternatives if one of their water points breaks. But if one of those water points breaks, go next to the animation. So if one of those water point breaks, then some proportion of that population is now unserved. They don't have an alternative within a 1 mile radius. And so what our algorithm works to do is it works to find the best water points to repair in order to serve the maximum number of people that do not have a nearby alternative. And then as it iterates and opens those or repairs those water points, it kind of recalculates and says, okay, now that I've fixed that water point, what's the next best place? And so it iterates through all of the different available water points in a country's inventory that are broken, and kind of looks at it in relation to world pop data and says, which one should I be repairing in order to help the most amount of people? What that allows us to do is to come up with a list of prioritized repairs. So this was something that we sent to the folks in Swaziland and the Department of Water Affairs in order to help them start to prioritize where they were going to go out and do repairs. They had limited budget for repairs, and so in order to actually make things happen, it's really important for them to be able to go to some of the best water points and repair them. And what we saw was that while some of these very high priority ones are serving a large number, or could serve a large number of people if they were repaired, towards the bottom of this list, I think that there were 300 or so, the bottom of that list starts to serve very few people. And so going to the top 10, the top 50 is much more important than getting to the very bottom of that list and fixing every single water point. So the one way that we brought this to life a little bit was by thinking about what an average approach looks like in contrast to a prioritized approach. So an average approach of fixing 50 water points would serve about 6,000 people, which is obviously a large number of people. But if we were to go to the top 50 non-functional water points as ranked by this algorithm, we would actually serve 14,000 people. And so by prioritizing where repairs are happening, we're serving an incremental 8,000 people for the exact same cost, which I think is a really powerful message to be able to show around why using data, why bringing together water point data, population data can be a really valuable exercise and can make budgets go twice as far, more than twice as far, which is a really compelling story to be able to tell. And then on the next slide, the other way that we thought about helping to serve people was how do we build new water points? Where do we see that there are opportunities to build water points? So what you see here is basically a simplified version of the algorithm that we used there, where basically we drew on a map all of the different, and not manually, drew on a map, all of the different lat longs and kind of much smaller lat longs in order to get to a grid of the country, and then looked at what the population within each of those grids were, and then understood how close that population, that dense population, was to its nearest water point. And then specifically focusing on blocks which didn't have any water points, we basically rank ordered by where there was the highest population in order to serve. So just kind of casting a broad net across the country, looking for where people are, and then trying to understand if there should be a water point there relative to the current inventory and also to the number of people that are there. So that's a second approach to actually building new water points. Bringing these two different pieces of analysis together, we wanted to ask the question, which is more efficient? How do you spend in order to help the most number of people? So on the left, if we were to repair the top 50 water points, we would help a little bit more than 14,000 people. Based on some numbers from talking with folks in the field, it cost about $200 on average to fix one of those water points for a total cost of $10,000, which means that we're serving about 14,000 people for about 70 cents per person. On the other side, we have building new water points. So the top 5 locations for building new water points did serve a larger population, almost 25,000 people. But because it is so expensive to build a water scheme from scratch, and there's so much planning that needs to go into it, the average cost per water point is $125,000, and the total cost is $600,000. So the cost per additional serve is $25, which means that looking across the two different options, the top 50 water points to be repaired is a 40 times better ROI investment to make versus building new water points. So there are certainly cases where it is better to build new water points where you're going to serve a large number of people who need access. But I think that it is also really relevant to think through how we can be doing that in a more efficient way, specifically through repairs. So some of the key takeaways and impact that we had from this specific analysis were basically bringing numbers to people that said, look at how efficient repairs can be. I think that folks that we talked to in Swaziland had a feeling that that was the case, but they had never really had any hard numbers that could actually prove that that was the case. And so we were able to help them bring that there. We also were able to help in securing budget for repairs. So in general, budget was always allocated towards new construction because that's how people felt they could help the most number of people. But there were smaller subsets of budget that were not specifically for building new things and could be reallocated in small ways to allow for budget for repair systems. And then lastly, obviously, just providing a list of repairs and giving them a set of the 50 places that they need to get to first, and that they can prioritize based on what their internal capabilities are, where they actually have the parts, actually evaluate what the issue is and if it's a straightforward thing to fix or not. But you need a starting point, which is the lat longs of those water points that needed to be repaired. So the last slide of our presentation starts to think a little bit more about data in general and some of our expertise from the private sector to understand how data could be leveraged better in the water sector from our perspective. So some of the key things that we wanted to call out, firstly, that it's really important to have a regular survey that is a representative sample of water points. And what that allows for is having really detailed information about water points that you can then project outwards to the full inventory. So how many people is it serving? What parts is it made out of? How often is it being repaired? All of these different sorts of things which you can use, and if it's a representative sample, can inform what things look like across an entire inventory. The second thing was being able to collect data regularly. I think that we'll probably talk about this more later in this webinar. But one of the things that we see is really important and effective on the private sector side and with the data that they have available there is being able to measure things over time. What that allows you to do is to understand causal things. So as changes in a marketplace happen, how are they causing impacts to things like water point accessibility? So for example, if we were able to measure water points over time, we could look at the implementation of policies to understand, do those policies change water point accessibility? And then the last thing, I think some of the most valuable analysis that we were able to do incorporated third-party data sets. So not just knowing things about a specific water point, but knowing how it relates to the broader environment around that water point, the population, the economic performance, et cetera, or things around the census. So the more that we can connect multiple data sets, the better that we can find interesting and compelling recommendations and suggestions on things to do. So yeah, I'm looking forward and hoping to answer as many questions as I can.
Thank you, Jake. That's an interesting presentation. I've seen a few questions come in through the question box. And just so if anyone joined late, please do type in your questions in the box on the GoToWebinar panel, and we'll be reading from those. We'll have about 15 minutes for questions, so I don't know how many of them we'll get to address. To Kim's question, Kimberly Worshman, hello. There are handouts. So if you want a copy of the presentation or are interested in just reading about what Jake just presented, you can get the handouts also on the GoToWebinar control panel. At the bottom of the panel, you'll find both handouts for both Jake's and Nick's presentation. So I have a question here, Jake. Like, what criteria was used to determine the likelihood of a breakdown? And you kind of touched on this on the presentation, but could you expand on that?
Sure. So basically, the way that we tackled that was we started with the population of points that had survived those first 5 years. So if we looked at when they were to when the next survey was, if they had survived those 5 years, then they were a 0. They hadn't broken. If they had broken, then they were a 1. So basically, and I guess I think that's what the question is around the criteria. But in terms of actually getting into the modeling, what we then did was we had a broad set of characteristics about the water point, census points around that water points, depending on what level of data or granularity we had, things like the unemployment rates, how close they were to other water points, how close they were to other things like spare parts places. And I think that in some cases we had 20 different attributes that we could potentially look at, and others we had like 100 different things. And one of the things that our software helps us do is look for statistically significant relationships among a broad set of attributes and filter those that are compelling and significant to the top so that we can start to use those to build a model. Hopefully that answers both sides of what that question might be asking about.
Okay, if there is an additional question stemming from this, you feel free to type it in, and I can also read it if you want Jake to continue sharing about that. There's another question about the types of population data that were used to prioritize the repairs. I guess the concern here is that there is a challenge to have mismatch of population data, so kind of like census data and water point asset data. So just to clarify, what type of data was it that you guys used?
Yeah, so we use world pop data, which is pixel point data, so 100 meter by 100 meter population density. And basically, we were able to kind of convert that into populations within specific areas around each water point by looking at them within different radii of each water point. So I completely agree that population data is definitely a messy thing to work with, but I think that if you're using a consistent methodology kind of throughout all of the different water points that you're tackling, hopefully that allows you to still get to a relevant and believable answer. And I do think that there are places to confirm. So I know that when we were in Swaziland, we did ask people to look at specific lat longs that we had called out and water schemes and kind of confirm that they agreed with the way that we were prioritizing things relative to their field expertise.
Okay. I'm seeing two questions that may or may not be related, but I'm going to put them together into one. So one is how long it took you to get all this data in place, which I'm relating to, how all these data points, 20,000 data points were collected. And so you mentioned initially that you used the WPDx database. So I suppose that's where the data was used, where that data came from, but how long did it take you to get the additional data to overlay with the WPDx data set? And then do you know a little bit about the source of the WPDx data?
Definitely. So I think I can speak to that pretty well. So that is one of the purviews of the Global Water Challenge, the Water Point Exchange data. Basically, what they do is they work with governments and other collectors of water point data to centralize it into a single location where they have hundreds of thousands of water points. The Swazi specific data comes from their national inventory done in 2015. Personally, I don't know too many more details about who executed on that. I think that I'm sure that Ariel and Brian Banks of Global Water Challenge would be able to give more detail there. But that is essentially where that Swazi data is coming from on the 20,000 points, and then also a bunch of the other metadata that they collected around each point as they visited it to evaluate whether or not it was broken, what type of water point it was, etc. In terms of the other third-party data, so some of it is easier to work with than other bits of data. All of it was publicly available, so WorldPop data is available and easy to download. I would probably put it at 2 to 3 weeks of pretty part-time work from some of our data experts at APT. So the way that our data dives work is we have 24 hours to execute on analysis, but there are a couple of weeks of prep leading up to it, where people are working on the side of their desk for a couple of hours a week to actually get that data into our software. So I guess I would put it at 1 week to kind of look at the environment and see what types of data were available and which ones we wanted to bring in, and then another 2 weeks or so to start to process it ahead of the data dive analysis.
Okay. Different question about the Sierra Leone calculator from actually one of my colleagues, Had. Hello. Had wanted to know whether the Sierra Leone calculator has been field tested and validated with the government, and if not, if there's any interest in doing so.
I would say that there is certainly interest. I don't believe that it has been validated. I think that there are plans to have a more concrete presentation with some stakeholders from Sierra Leone in the water sector, but I don't believe that it is actively being used. I may be wrong there because I think that it was passed over to them. I just haven't heard how it's being used yet. But yeah, I would love to connect on whether or not it can be field tested and what next steps would be there. Which actually reminds me that for anybody who wants to send an email after, or if I can answer questions more effectively, my email is jintrator, JINTRATOR, @aptmail.com.
Thank you, Jake. We'll probably have you, I believe that your email is also in the handouts. It might be there. So, and if not, that's something that we can definitely share through the comment section here in the webinar. In case like people didn't type it quickly enough. There's another question which is like similar to the previous one that has to do more with use, like what happens after all this data becomes available. And so can you speak a little bit more about, you know, in your examples, has there been experiences or cases in which these findings or insights have led to actual policy changes or different practices? Like from the examples that you shared, like were you able to see different decisions being made by the government in Swaziland or in the case of Sierra Leone? Yeah, can you speak more to that?
Sure. Yeah, so I think that Swaziland is definitely the best example of where we did start to see that changes could happen. I think that specifically where that was the most common was around that slide showing the efficiency of repairs versus building new water points. So in general, the way that budgets seemed to work was that they were always prioritized towards building new water points because that was kind of what success was defined as. It was access and it was availability of water. But what was eye-opening to people was that they didn't need a huge budget in order to start doing repairs, that going to the first 50 water points would only cost 10,000 US, so more in Rand. But that budget could start to come from other smaller bits and pieces and could be cobbled together in order to start to help a substantial number of people. So I think as we were leaving, there were a lot of active conversations around which budgets could be adapted and which ones were not explicitly and exclusively for building new water points. I can't promise that those budgets have actually been shifted in that way, but I think that we heard a lot of compelling conversation around plans to do that. And I think that we're very curious to know if that was actually executed as well.
So, and I guess related to this, so one of the things that, I work on M&E, so, and I know that this is important, that when you design a process in order to dive into data or analyze data, you usually involve the potential users of the results of your dive, right? Or your analysis. So to what extent were, local government or national government officials involved in the design or the analysis of, the data dive overall?
Yeah, so as we scope out a data dive, a lot of the questions that we ask are, what are your key problems? What are you trying to solve? And I think that the first set of answers we got tended to be much more around just reporting on the inventory. People were asking basically, what types of water points do we have? What types have broken? What types have not broken? Things like that, which I think are good findings and can certainly be visualized in compelling ways that are helpful to making decisions. But I think that there hadn't been a lot of data being utilized in this space in the past to provide concrete recommendations around actions. And so I think that we felt that we were kind of pushing folks to see data in new ways and bringing in some of our private sector experience on how other folks have used data around almost in the way that you would plan the network for a set of stores to do that for water points in order to maximize the number of people that you're serving. So I will say yes, like governments were definitely involved. I think specifically the Swazi Department of Water Affairs was checked in with several times. Brian Banks kind of coordinated a lot of that work. But that there is still a long way to go before people are really fully aware of ways that data can be used in their day-to-day, and that starting to centralize data in this water point data exchange is a really good start, but that there are certainly places to go, especially around continuous evaluation and monitoring of water point data.
Okay. There's several other questions popping up, so a ton of interest, Jake. We're gonna have to move fairly quick, but just one last question, if you can touch on data quality and the accuracy of the data that you use, both from the WPDx data set, but also from the third-party providers. Can you share a little bit more about that? And then after this question, then we'll wrap up and go on to next presentation.
Okay. So in terms of data quality, I agree that is definitely a challenge. I think that the way that we tried, or like WPDx does a very good job of starting to standardize the way that people are reporting things. So making sure that it's less reliant on free-form text and people are selecting from kind of a set of coded things to describe what a water point looks like. Is it broken or is it not broken, etc. But so, like, I think that was very helpful to us. I do think we had to have some trust, right, in that when people executed a water point inventory, that they were truly executing on it. We weren't really able to do field validation of whether or not a point that was supposedly broken was broken. And I think that one of the things that we ran into that was really difficult was if a point was built in 2000 and the next inventory happened in 2015, and we know that it's broken, did it break in 2010? Did it break in 2005? We're not really sure. And so there were definitely a lot of challenges that kind of guided the way that we actually approached questions. So I think that it's a very valid thing to say. On the third-party data, I think that we did feel a little bit more confident. In general, we were trying to rely on things that are publicly available and publicly used, such as World Pop, such as the census, that are coming from these individual countries. So I think we did feel pretty comfortable there. But like one of the limiting factors there is granularity. Some of these censuses happen at a pretty broad district level as opposed to in the US where you're going down to block groups and they're pretty granular. So data availability is always a tricky thing. I think that we felt like there's a lot of opportunity kind of regardless of whether or not everything is always 100% correct. And that there's also a lot of opportunity to continue to improve the way that data is collected. And hopefully that transitions well to the next section around other ways that data can be validated and worked on and collected.
Okay, great, Jake. Thank you again for your presentation and for taking time to answer questions. You can also look through the question box, and if you want to answer any of those directly by typing in, you can also do that. We're going to move on to next presentation to make sure that we remain within the allocated time for the webinar. So Nick Dickinson is a lead expert at WASHNote and also an associate at IRC. Through his career, Nick has been advising country-led monitoring and evaluation of water and sanitation services at national, district, and municipal levels. Nick provides training for water and sanitation agencies on national monitoring and evaluation systems, decentralized data collection, data processing, and life cycle costing. Nick has also evaluated mobile-enabled water, sanitation, and energy services for the Mobiles for Development Utility Innovation Fund as a grant panel member. He also supports the commissioning and procurement of technology for governments in the WASH sector, as well as supporting the development of data exchange and technology standards such as WPDx. So Nick, if you're ready, when you're ready, the screen is yours.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, Ethel, and all the rest. And also, thanks also for the first presentation by Jake and Trader. And I thought that was very, very rich and interesting. And it's great also to be able to see, you know, what we can do with WaterPoint data in the future if we start to standardize things a bit more and improve the quality of the data. It looks very, very promising. So that's very exciting to see. And thanks so much for that. Yeah, so maybe just to, I think, you know, the introduction was very detailed, so I don't need to say anything more than that about myself, but it's just to say that, you know, the work we did on the white paper was under the WADA Alliance with USAID and Coca-Cola, and we worked on that also with IRC in Uganda. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so one of the quotes from the paper is, you know, we have to keep the current services functional. The most critical question is not how to breach the gap to 100% coverage, it is how to sustain the services. Then at the end of that is data that does not trigger action should not be collected. I think, you know, this is a key point we'll keep coming back to, and that was by Antonio Rodriguez Serrano from the World Bank. And yeah, so this white paper is available in the handout section, and you can just download it here, or you can also go to, for example, the IRC website or the WASHNote website to download it or Google it. Yeah, next slide. So one thing I wanted to take out of a video and a script that was written by the late Ton Schouten, who was the chair of the Rural Water Supply Network, is you do not need to know everything. Knowing is not necessarily the same as using. And I think, this will go back to, I think, Jake's presentation from APT and the data dive about how it's not always about knowing everything, or even, let's say, the quality of a particular data point, but it's rather, how can we use it to make a change and to achieve sustainable services. So yeah, okay, next slide. So I think we can skip ahead, I think, to slide 6. Yeah. So I mean, I think the definition of water point was given already, specifically for water point data. Just to say, I mean, usually, yeah. So we're talking about point sources, but we're also talking about supplier or distribution points. So it's quite broad. And what it is. What are water point data? Is there a set of records which uniquely identify water points and provide additional attributes? Those attributes can be all kinds of things, from the water quality, to aspects of groundwater, to even the performance of the service provider, or tariff collection by a vendor. So it can be quite broad in the picture I'm going to present here. So globally, we haven't talked a whole lot about WPDx, but it will come up a lot in this presentation. And we are now starting to see a lot more communities of practitioners around water point mapping and tools. I think it's becoming a standard. Mobile data collection is becoming very common. So I think we've learned a lot about lowering the cost of data collection in terms of the technologies. And increasingly, data is also being shared online, with more than 400,000 water points being shared on WPDx, I believe, at this point. And but what we can say is that there's not a lot of documentation about how it's being used, and there's really a need for more guidelines on how to use how to use data. And I think this white paper is really just a start. So it's not to say that it covers all points, but I think it gives a pretty good overview and lots of references. Next slide, please. Yeah. So I think we'll go ahead to the next slide, because let's talk about the challenges. So there are a lot of unique approaches to how water point data is being collected at the moment. I mean, we see that also in the WPDx data set, where we've tried to standardize it by using a minimum set of common fields, for example, the latitude, the longitude, whether water is present or not, or the status, or some people call it functionality, but a simplistic binary variable. And and we're seeing that there's not a lot of standardization beyond that, beyond what we've done in WPDx. Not everybody is sharing the information, and data collection remains costly. So if we look at fuel and travel time, it's not easy to do, and you need sufficient capacity in order to do that. And finally, dissemination is still a problem. So we still have a little ways to go. So in terms of uses of water point data, I'm just going to go over this very quickly, because in the white paper you can find more cases, and I hope at some point we'll be able to publish a case library online, because we have a lot more data that we weren't able to put into the white paper to keep it to a decent length. But it's being used right now in all kinds of ways, from service provision, and we see that, for example, even with automatic dispensers being sold by companies like Grundfos or Sustec, in asset management, for example, some of the tools that are free to download from Water for People and IRC on using water point inventories in order to start an asset management inventory and database. And then there's also quite a few examples of financing and budgeting. One which is interesting is Charity Water, using remote sensors to track water points and communicate to some of their donors about that. Also in operations, just for tracking whether or not they're working or not. Water resources management, including keeping a database of water points in order to know the water rights. For example, in the US, that's done in some states. And And then much more performance management, partnerships are being formed on the basis of water points, and I think we'll see some of that. So next slide, please. So what I'd like to kind of underline is how at the moment, we're seeing water point maps, but where we really need to start going to is seeing how a water point is changing over time and what's happening to the service that's being provided from that water point. And when we have a profile of a water point where you can see different organizations playing different roles, and whether that's an implementer or the district, then it becomes much more useful and it becomes much easier to make decisions about water points and what should happen and what went wrong. Next slide, please. In addition, the time between data collection is a problem at the moment. Just as was mentioned by Jake, it was impossible to know when a water point broke down. And clearly adding an attribute like about when the last breakdown occurred could be useful in spot checks like water point inventories in order to help with that. But at the same time, there's also a need to make it part of routine monitoring. So in other words, that data is actually collected during routine activities, whether that's an activity of an engineer or a pump mechanic or someone else. Next slide. In addition, there are aspects about water points that aren't always being collected, and with the focus on the SDGs and safely managed water, we really have to start moving towards looking at service indicators and also aspects of sustainability. All right, so we've broken this up into a number of lessons, and so the first lesson really is know the point. So we have to start ensuring that water point records are unambiguous. GPS alone hasn't really proven to be enough to be able to monitor water points and know them and use them on a routine basis. One of the questions to ask is it possible to update a water point based on a phone call or a conversation, which is often a feasible way to get information about a water point. So I think I'm not going to talk about this in detail, but I've listed a few different countries where I've worked, and I've seen a difficulty in matching. Sometimes it's community codes, sometimes it's water point codes across different inventories. In one case, there were 3 different data sets that had to be reconciled. And the ambiguity limits the type of analysis that we can do. It makes it harder to talk about water points, and reconciling the data can be costly, and either in terms of time or also in terms of actual travel costs. And some of the solutions are using WPDx. So for example, Initiative O in Burkina Faso also found another organization and started working with H2O map in order to jumpstart water quality monitoring in new communities. And since they found out that those water points were already mapped, they could continue. So in terms of implementers should really identify and use existing data before starting. Okay, next slide, please. And then we're going to go pretty quick here. Okay, so Interaid in Bombali is a very interesting case, because this is that I wanted to highlight from Sierra Leone. And there, a caretaker does a bi-weekly minor maintenance. And on an annual basis, the community hires an official pump technician for major maintenance. This is just in communities that have accepted to be in the program. And then they also track with the district some of the communities which are not in the program. And the great thing about the data here is, well, even though they don't have the GPS coordinates, and they have had difficulty matching the water points from the national inventory to the district inventory, they're still able to work and talk about the water points with the mechanics. Okay, next slide, please. In terms of authorities, and that's local authorities, and national authorities. It's important to also give some guidance and encourage, where capacity isn't there to give guidance, encourage all those in a district or an area to, to use WaterPoint data, to collect it, to share it, to talk about it. And I think, yeah, there are numerous examples of that. But next slide, please. In terms of finance and knowing WaterPoints, it's important, I think, to require grantees and businesses to evaluate WaterPoint data and sustainability metrics in order to come up with value for money measures. And I can talk to several, but I think there will be a slide on that later. Okay, so this is an interesting slide, and in this slide, what one can see is that, well, this is from a study and that was funded by Portland State University, done with Living Water International in Rwanda. And it was an interesting look at using WaterPoint data as in a research setting, but also in a setting of service delivery within the model of Living Water International. And what they did was they had a baseline value for how, what functionality rate they had managed to achieve for WaterPoints. And then they wanted to look and see whether with remote monitoring they could improve that functionality, whether they could make it cost efficient. And what they did is they compared 3 different models, a basic nominal model, then a circuit rider model where a few people are on motorcycles riding around to different communities, then an ambulance model which used sensors on the pump developed by Portland State University in order to give an alert whenever the pump would break down. And what they found actually was that the functionality of the ambulance model was around 90%, circuit rider model around 72%, and the nominal model was 67%. So in other words, there was a huge jump in functionality. There's a lot more details in the link that's provided. But what's also interesting is that the total cost per pump per functional year, which in the end is what counts, so the value that was achieved, even though it costs more to put the sensors on the pumps, the cost per functional year was not higher than, or not much higher. It was around the same price as the other models, but yet achieving a much higher functionality rate in an area. Next slide, please. So some of the steps to take and to think about are, what are your goals and activities? What kind of WaterPoint data can help? And I think it's also about what kind of other data can help, obviously. So bringing in population data, I think that the APT example shows that really well. But in terms of WaterPoint data, the location, functionality, but especially service level information can be useful. Are you looking at just installation and then maintenance, CapManX, OpEx, operational costs, tariff information, spare parts? I've used a lot of these different kinds of information in order to do analyses, but it was always focused on, will the spare parts business model work? Can we provide services that will be continuous, etc.? So it's important to start on the basis of the goals. And then use WPDx to identify which organizations are already publishing data, because that will give you some information about who to talk to. Also look at national WaterPoint inventories and national guidelines and standards to try and work with government. And that's a crucial point if we want to have sustainable solutions that last longer than implementation projects. And then talk to others, try to use the same codes and build on existing WaterPoint data and prioritize activities. I think by following a lot of these steps, we can address some of the issues that were raised by APT. Next slide, please. Okay, so universal lesson 2 is, track the WaterPoint. So we talked a little bit about this and publishing it. Next slide, please. So what we mean by tracking is being able to know how it's changed over time. And I think, if we look at a number of different cases that are discussed in the white paper, there's, for example, in Tigray, it was an interesting example that we looked at in 2015 with IRC. There were many different databases. And, the Tigray Water Resources Bureau had a database. There's the National Water Inventory. But there was a lack of a single approach. And as a result, it was difficult to use the data. And then REST, an organization working with funding from Charity Water, was doing remote monitoring and tracking of water points in Tigray, generating profile of each of their points and acting on it. So actually, funding activities to address problems as they were identified. So it was in one area where you have two different approaches, and yet they weren't really talking to each other. And I think there have been some developments since then. And but I think this is not just about Tigray, which actually had a very rich environment and a lot of potential, but in general in our sector, we're operating with a lack of a single approach, and as a result, we can't actively work together. Another example, Kamwenge, where I believe Water for People were helping to develop district investment plans. That helped activate participation of local politicians, and there are more examples. The picture is from one of the Charity Water pumps. Okay, next please. So in terms of implementers, the main recommendations are to use the existing standards, especially national frameworks. So it is important not just to use WPDx, let's say, to share information and to find partners, but really to try and integrate into national frameworks where they are and coordinate with local government, national government, because it increases visibility and also the legitimacy of outcomes. In the end, there are a lot of frameworks that are available. There are the national frameworks, there's simple standards like the Water Point Data Exchange, but there are also the JMP SDG indicators. It's good to become familiar with these different frameworks and identify whether or not they are relevant to your particular case and how you can play a role in increasing their use. So I think for authorities, the main thing is just use Water Point data to tell the story of services, to tell it to politicians, to financiers, and to users, and use evidence-based investment plans. So so that way, it becomes also more personal, and everybody buys into this idea of improving formal water services, which not everybody has bought into, by the way. Next, please. So a little more detail on the Kamwenge district investment plans, as it's an interesting case. Their data were used in coordination meetings for the distribution of resources, enhancing the functionality of water points, and generally advocating for water services. But what was interesting about this case is that they developed district investment plans in 2015, but that looked and projected data all the way up to 2030. So starting with the projection of what is required to achieve 100% coverage, and then asking, if we're going to reach that, what do we need, and how do we sustain that, and what's the amount of financial resources needed. So in other words, doing that analysis in advance really enabled politicians to start to talk about water services and what's needed and start to advocate it. Next, please. Yeah, and for donors and investors, I think, to build these profiles of water points and really to be able to lower the transaction costs and the complexity for everybody, and we need still to keep developing standards. I think definitely in terms of data exchange, definitely in terms of also how we analyze data and also what we expect to find. So the sustainability frameworks was a recent study by the World Bank on how sustainability is being monitored across a number of countries. I believe RWSN is working on this. These kind of standards will be useful not only for implementers and donors, but they'll also be useful for governments, which also look for easy to use guidelines and recommendations, especially when they're building up systems from scratch. Next, please. So in terms of the steps to take, I think it's important to communicate the value of water point data and embed it in routine activities. Analyze needs, like in Kamwenge, engage in local meetings and processes, and disseminate locally, and progressively improve data completeness and reliability. This was one of the issues they faced in Kamwenge, but over time, one can improve data completeness. And I think over time we can improve it, but we need to keep sharing information. And I think it's worth saying that that takes time, so we need to be a little bit easygoing about it, but it also takes some strength because you have to take risk and acknowledge the limitations of the data and continue to improve it over time. The next, please. So finally, the last lesson is about direct support. So we're talking about WaterPoint data, but at the same time, WaterPoint data won't do anything unless we can act on it. And when we talk about direct support, we mean the support that's being provided by, for example, authorities and others to service providers and communities to ensure continuous service provision. And I've provided some links, if you download the presentation later, to some tools that can be used to calculate, for example, direct support costs and read more about it. Next, please. So some of the cases that are interesting for me, for example, Vernier Hydro came up with, I believe, working with UNICEF. They've presented a few times about a DUMA public-private partnership concept where Vernier Hydro, for example, would match 50% of investment for a minimum of 500 new hand pumps in one area with a minimum of 225,000 inhabitants. And then on the basis of that contract, they would be able to ensure functionality for 15 years. So in other words, what's happening is, Vernier Hydro is coming in and saying, well, we'll provide support or that umbrella for continuous service provision, do the remote monitoring, and they even, as part of the model, will publish to WPDx from time to time. So you also will start having longitudinal data in databases like WPDx. Other interesting models are, we talked about the ambulance model from the model of Interaid and circuit riders, which all are, models that we can look at to use WaterPoint data more in real time locally. So we're not just doing one-off surveys. And then performance management is also very important to look at and talk about. I think some cases to look at our hand pump mechanics in Uganda, the DIMES water services framework in Ghana, and CSR in Latin America. Next, please. So so for local government, it's just important to use WaterPoint data to plan corrective actions and to design with partners, and and just really try to work with the same standards and indicators and include lessons about the minimum data needed. I think that's another aspect. I think someone recently wrote a blog about minimum viable data. Often we're trying to collect too much information or be too academic about it, but there's a minimum amount of information we may need for operations. I think we should focus on that more often, and then sampling. So in terms of NGOs and implementers, it's also important to start to support governments to develop and improve their monitoring systems rather than just driving project monitoring. And district-wide approaches can help with that because it gives us a lot of time. A district-wide approach, like the Agenda for Change, which I'll talk about in a sec, can improve coordination and long-term results together with government. So I think I just talked about this, but basically just to say that, if we can have local projects fitting into a larger framework, then we can start to make more rational decisions, I think, at a level of a nation or a district. And I think I've already talked a bit about this, so let's go to the next one. But it is just worth saying that monitoring without action is costly, and it's really just not worth it. And it's part of the reason maybe we haven't seen monitoring is we haven't been linking it enough to monitoring. So I just wanted to give this link to the IRC roadmap, to the Agenda for Change on the last slide, because it's, can you go back one slide? Yeah. Because this gives also an interesting step-by-step approach that one can use in a district if you want more information. Okay, next please. So then in terms of the steps, in order to be able to focus on direct support, I think we have to start with a vision and introduce that when we're working wherever we are and whoever we are, and focus on sustainable services at scale, engage and coordinate with national and local institutions determine needs using the best available WaterPoint data and other sources, and engage partners such as researchers. And then clarifying roles and responsibilities is crucial. We're working on the enabling environment to understand who does what and when, as that will help us also use data more efficiently. And then finally, again, incrementally improve operations and performance based on evidence. So anyway, you don't need to know everything. Knowing is not necessarily the same as using. So I think the more we can focus moving away from just surveys to routine monitoring and direct support, I think the further we'll get. And I hope some of these links have been helpful. I think there was maybe one more slide. So yeah, so the conclusions are: know the point, identify it uniquely, use it locally, track it, and then focus on direct support and routine monitoring. Ensure minimum data is collected, and finally use data, and analysis needs to become part of a habit in coordination, task setting, and planning. And it's going to take some time, but it's worth it. We'll be able to accelerate progress towards universal access. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Nick. I've read the paper. I encourage everyone who's interested in what Nick has talked about to take a look. It contains a ton of information, as was noted, throughout his presentation. A lot of really good suggestions and recommendations and how to work better with WaterPoint data and best practices around that. So we have some time for questions. If you have any questions, please write them down on the panel. We have a few questions already coming in, but I want to start with one like overarching one, Nick. I know that a lot of the content of the paper comes from your experience working in the WASH sector, but was there anything specific that was done in order to compile all these insights for this paper, like special interviews or any particular activity that you took to understand where this paper comes from?
Sure. Yeah. So, well, yeah, partly my experience, but what we did was we worked with IRC Uganda in order to really catalyze a discussion in Uganda together with the government and other organizations that have been using WaterPoint data. And the reason why we chose Uganda was that they had already published their entire inventory on WPDx, and they have a great national water atlas, which is online. And I think one of the links is in my presentation. And there are a lot of organizations like Water for People or the Water Trust and WaterAid, who have been working there for a while using data at a local level. So whether that's at service level or at district level or at national level. So it was very insightful, and I think we pulled a lot out of that. We also had interviews with various, let's say, leaders or people who have played a role in WaterPoint mapping and in water service monitoring. And there's a huge list in the paper itself in our references, which you can find. So we did a lot of desk research as well, to complement those interviews as well. So yeah, I think that's pretty much where it came from. And then we tried to think about what are the various needs across government, national governments, local governments, implementers, and financiers, in order to come up with recommendations for each of those groups.
Were you cut off?
Oh, hello. Yeah, at what point did I cut off? Yeah, so
implementer.
Yeah, so implementers, also for financiers, and then we tried to develop recommendations for each of those specific groups. And I think what I would love to do now in the future is to have some time to actually pull all the cases that we collected, which we now have in a big reference database, and publish that online.
Yeah, it'd be great to continue to learn from those experiences. And the reason I asked the question was as I read the paper, it seemed to contain so much from different perspectives that made it like truly valuable. And where anyone working, whether you're a funder or a local government official or someone who's out collecting data, like there's recommendations for multiple levels and layers. So it's good to see a compilation from such different perspectives. We have a few questions. There's one in particular about suggestions on, the need for longitudinal data and what you've seen and how that can be improved, because it's hard to do. It's hard to make decisions about how things change whenever you don't have data over several years. So in your experience, or from the process of gathering all the insights for this paper, like, did you run into good examples of how to improve into getting data over time?
Yeah. So I think basically this is the key question, or one of the key questions around data, and all the recommendations are sort of crafted in order to try to get data over time. So, part of the reason that we suggest using something like WPDx, and then I don't think it's a perfect solution, but I think it's maybe the simplest and best solution we have for the moment, is that, if everybody would be publishing their information to one public database, and that we were able to download that in advance before going in the field and doing additional data collection, then we would be able to see immediately, whether or not the prior data point was located in the correct location. Is there a problem with the GPS coordinates? What was the status at the time of that spot check? And I think we would be going a lot further in terms of being able to bring about affordable tools for analysis. Because frankly, I think we can do a lot of analysis. I mean, if we get the right people, we can do all kinds of very interesting analysis. In Sierra Leone, we've just done a projection for the SDGs until 2030, and on the basis of that, and what we thought, roles and responsibilities, let's say, should be at district level, we did a calculation of how many sites you would need to visit every year, right? And on the basis of that, okay, how much fuel and per diems do you need? And getting those kind of costs for direct are very interesting for monitoring and for getting that kind of longitudinal data. But until we can get this data, not just from, let's say, surveys, and not just that are going into WPDx, but as soon as it's coming, let's say, from a remote sensor, or if it's coming as part of a circuit writer's regular daily reports, then I think we'll start to have longitudinal data. I think it's, if we look at the case of private service providers, even on small pipe systems, they're much more likely to be presenting annual reports and being able to make useful decisions on the basis of those, and talk in useful ways to, let's say, districts or governments or investors about their needs. So I think the closer we can get to making data as part of operations rather than just as part of surveys, which are, by the way, also important. But I think we need to now start focusing more on using data in operations.
Yeah. Great. Another interesting question, M&E can, like, monitoring or evaluation can be done from different approaches or perspectives. And, often we hear about, the need for learning and for improving as part of the primary goal for monitoring and evaluation. But there's also this other side that has to do with accountability. And yeah, overall, just making sure that people are held responsible for what they're doing, and the need for data in order to do that. Do you see a tension there with the examples you explored and what you've seen in the field?
I think there's a tension in people's minds. I think a lot of times people think about monitoring. For example, when I was in Sierra Leone not so long ago, somebody told me, well, if you say you're an M&E officer, then people think of you as a policeman or a policewoman, and and as a result, they don't really want to work with you, And then and if you're seen as a police person, but then you're not actually given any tools for, let's say, enforcing the rules or ensuring you can collect the data, then that's not very useful. So I do think that there can be a problem in people's minds about it, but this is where I think advocacy and communication about data and about how it can be used is so important. So we need to really start, taking the little bit of data that we do have and start sharing that more proactively with the districts and with the people who really are supposed to be getting supportive supervision. I mean, we're not talking about policing people. In some cases, there can be policing, but I think what's more likely going to be useful, or what's going to happen, is where you have performance management, where you have a symbiotic relationship. And this is what you see, for example, in the health sector, is, for example, in Ethiopia, they have a volunteer, army, health army, which is collecting data at the village level, and then there's a few levels, and then you get up to the WADA, which is like a district level, and at each level, and then at national level, there's performance management of the data from the level below, and not all the data gets carried up to the next level. Some of the data is used at that local level, and then synthesized, and then it's reported up to the next one, and that's used as part of a performance management system. And then you can use surveys to kind of fact check and quality control that. But I think, if you do it in terms of supportive supervision and performance control, and if you are disseminating the results of analysis rather than using it to penalize people, you're using it to engage in discussions, I think we can get over this perception, that that there's a problem between accountability and learning. No, I think actually we need to learn about how to be more accountable and how to achieve results, which we're not achieving at the moment. So it's all of us.
Yeah. Yep. We're going to have to start wrapping up soon, but I wanted to just ask one final question. This has to do with the ownership of data. We have these databases, open databases such as WPDx, where organizations can contribute data to the database. And so, what role does government play there in terms of, like, do they act as kind of like the facilitators or the review process of the data that should flow into databases like WPDx, or how do you see that process of sharing data openly? And would having governments be that place where data from different organizations is kind of checked or validated? Yeah. Would that provide more ownership to governments, but maybe like reduce incentives in order to share data openly? Yeah. Or what do you see a tension there, or how to address that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think WPDx per se is something that governments will have to review ever, because what I hope WPDx will remain is a data exchange standard. So in other words, you can use that standard to exchange data between two parties or within a district, or globally, and share it with everybody, which has probably the greatest value. And there's a lot of reasons for that. If you're looking at a market for investors, or creating the investment we need to maintain services, not just put them in place for the SDGs, then we need new models and we need new kinds of finance. And to do that, we need data so we can convince investors to invest in our markets. Whether that's public, by the way, or private. And so I think the role of government is essential, because in the end, government is there to regulate and create an environment which is a little bit predictable and where people will be sharing information. But I think the kind of thing that government can do is say that, well, we expect organizations who are working in our country to share data. We expect at minimum they use, for example, WPDx, so that we know which water points and where they're working, which is basically what WPDx tells you. It doesn't tell you a lot about the water points themselves. And then, or it could even be, well, we expect you to use WPDx at minimum, and these are also the minimum performance indicators on which we're going to evaluate the services you're providing. And if we have minimum performance indicators, that might also include, for example, a little extra addition to the WPDx dataset where people can self-report how they're doing on those indicators. But I would see a future where most governments are in a position to at least do a bit of spot checking themselves and verify whether or not people are doing, in fact, what they're saying they're doing. So hopefully getting more reporting coming out of activities of implementers, activities of public agencies, and then a little bit of fact checking in order to make sure that the data is up to standard.
Yeah, so again, to the point of accountability, and I guess in this case for accountability for generating good quality data that is accurate. Okay, well, thank you so much, Nick. We need to wrap up so that we can remain in time. Thank you both, our presenters. Both presentations have been great. Again, I encourage everyone who hasn't read Nick's paper to take a look. Just to wrap up, a few points that I noted that I think are worth rescuing. It's just data can help us improve, and in the sense of effectiveness and efficiency of how we provide services. So important to take a look at all those PDFs and spreadsheets that are sometimes just stored on our computers and try to figure out, how can we process that data, analyze that data, share that data more widely so that we can help improve service delivery. If we, in the world of the SDGs, that's going to become increasingly important because the way the sector has been working would lead us towards not achieving the SDGs, and we need to make sure that things change for the better if we do want to improve or achieve those SDGs. Another point on, from Jake's presentation, the data dive they did wouldn't have been possible had, there been no sources of open data. And so just to the importance of sharing data widely and openly and being able to follow standards such as WPDx to make sure that the data contains at least the minimum requirements for quality or completeness that are necessary in order to perform certain types of data analysis. As we move, again, in this process of the SDGs, just to think about inequalities and inequities and what else can we say from the data that we already have about how to breach those gaps in inequality of service provision and what people have access to and who's receiving services and who's not. And again, I hope this was a useful webinar for everyone. I think it's important for us to continue to do this, not only to share what we're doing, but also to get feedback and have a space where we can have a little bit of peer review in some way, and we can bounce ideas off each other so that we can improve the way services are delivered around the world. So yeah, with those few thoughts, I'd like to just wrap up. Thank you very much for joining.
Thanks so much.